I'm Kira Cleveland, and this is Human Intelligence. With my co-host, Ned Hayes, we talk about the importance of human creativity in the age of AI. Welcome to the future.
The Human Intelligence Podcast is excited to welcome Robert Townsend to the show. He's the Director of Humanities, Arts, and Culture Programs at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In this capacity, he oversees the Academy's Humanities, Arts, and Culture programs, as well as the Humanities Indicators that are published nationally. He's the author of History's Babel and over 200 articles on various aspects of history and higher education and publishing. He holds a PhD in history and new media from George Mason University. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Well, thanks. Great to meet you, Ned.
So first of all, since you post quite a bit about the humanities, I would love it if you could define what are the humanities at a high level?
Well, there are kind of two definitions of the humanities. One usually is a list of academic disciplines, and the other is a much broader sort of sense that the human subject in all its capacities and all its sort of many gifts and blessings is something that should be studied through a variety of different ways. And so we look at it through words, through history, through sort of how we sort of conceptualize and think of the world and look out at it and engage with it through language and through other sources. And I kind of feel more comfortable with that understanding of it, more broad definition, because, we did a survey of the public about 5 years ago asking them, what do you think of this thing we call the humanities? And we discovered using that label just doesn't get you very far because most people, a sizable portion of people associate it with things like charitable giving blood, sort of humanitarianism. Other people think of like science because that involves human bodies, right? So as a term, it doesn't really resonate, I think, with a lot of people in the general public, even though when we ask people about how often they engage with things like reading history books or just reading fiction or watching historical shows on TV, we found that there's extensive engagement with different types of humanistic activities. And so we feel like this is why we need to sort of try and stretch ourselves and think beyond just the traditional academic disciplines as a way of understanding what the humanities are and really can be for most people.
Yeah. Well, given that broad definition, I'll ask you this kind of follow-up question, which is, how did the humanities create the world that we live in today?
I mean, so much of what we think we know about what we know comes from the accretion of history and the various sort of ideas that have shaped the world that we live in today. I mean, the difference between the arguments that one could have just over the term liberalism and what that means. So much of that is just historically based in philosophy, in language, and all the various subjects that constitute the humanities come together in the environment and the world that we live in, kind of beyond the physical. And so much of what we fight about is in these intangibles that actually drive so much of human experience. And that's really where I think the real fun and a lot of the action actually is, and what makes life worth living.
Absolutely. Well, and so thinking of the humanities as kind of deep engagement with the big questions, if I could venture my own kind of definition, the big questions of what it means to be human, of what it means to create in the world, and what it means to interact, which kind of covers the grounds of sociology, history, languages, even drama and creative pursuits. All of this was true to some extent of like ancient Greek cultures or ancient Chinese cultures. And yet in the 1700s and 1800s, there was a huge explosion of literacy. And that really changed the face of democracy. It changed how people thought about the world. It changed how people absorbed information and the capability to absorb information and have opinions. Could you speak about that kind of explosion of literacy?
I mean, really, the explosion happens around the 1500s, which is when you start to get the wars of religion. And so much of the sort of the European, I mean, if you look at it from a European perspective, the what happened in Europe in terms of the sort of creation of the printing press, the sort of freedom of the ability to read the Bible,
Yeah.
and the sort of ongoing effects of that, which in many ways created the liberalism in the classic sense that we live in today, because a lot of people realized, killing each other over who we choose to, or who and how we choose to worship, is not a good way to live, and it, not particularly healthy for a society. And so I think that a lot of that, which we now sort of, I think, take for granted, was something that had to be sort of was literally fought over in terms of ideas and the kind of the nature of the world as we conceive of it. Those sorts of things are where I think the humanities can summon us back to a past where we can remember why so many of the things we take for granted had to be developed, had to be worked out, had to become an intrinsic part of the way we shape society. And I think too often now we tend to take for granted some of the reasons behind the world that we live today. And to me, as a historian, I think going back and recovering some of that can actually be incredibly useful as a way of kind of re-engaging with the world that often seems too big and too distant and challenging to us in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So I guess part of the reason I was thinking about the literacy question as a kind of canary in the coal mine for the humanities is that, in the 1800s, early 1800s, the illiteracy rate was could vary between 80% for some populations to 20% for the more general population, or 20 to 30%. And by like the late 1970s, we were down to like 1% of people who were illiterate. And so we had people reading multiple newspapers per day, people informing themselves, people having opinions that were well grounded in factual information. The reason I mentioned this foundation is that we're now almost moving into a post-literate zone, aren't we?
To some extent. I mean, I have a figure that I like to show when I'm talking to humanities faculty from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which has been asking, since I graduated from high school in '84, it asks, how often do you read, of like 13 and 18-year-olds?
Mm-hmm.
And it found that when in '84, about 70% of kids said they were reading at least once a week. So very pretty, or more often than that. So very regularly. That percentage has now gone down to, I want to say, 36%. And the share of students who say they read rarely or never is now up to almost 2/3 of that student population. So I think
that's a change.
And so, and that's long form reading. So, when you look at kind of the top level literacy, most people can read. The problem is that when you look at kind of at the different levels in the NAEP test, you see that that proficiency with reading, which is the ability to take, like you said, multiple sources of information, put them together, sort of analyze how they relate to each other and kind of synthesize them. Like that ability is where a lot of this, the literacy is beginning to really fundamentally decline. And I think that's a big part of the reason the humanities are really suffering right now in terms of losing, students studying the subjects and those sorts of questions, is just since tend to be very text-based disciplines, especially in the academy, and folks just have lost that ability to, and comfort really, with long form reading, sort of thinking about how it relates to other things, like those sorts of skills. We've become very sort of instantaneous in terms of so we see a piece of information, we react to that, rather than thinking about how we pull together different pieces of information and think about, well, is this accurate? Is this true? I think the effects of smartphones and social media, like those sorts of things, have eroded a lot of the real capacity to actually engage with texts in ways that are, we're doing some focus groups with high school students, and we found, they say, well, I like math and science because it's so easy. It's like, I just don't have the attention span to really read, anything, to really read anything terribly long. And I think that's really part of the challenge that we're now facing as a larger field and really as a larger society, is that capacity to to sort of think critically about the information that we're seeing and getting is, I think, diminished substantially by that lack of engagement with text and engagement with reading in a substantive way.
Right. So you just mentioned one of the factors that contributes to that lack of engagement with reading texts that are challenging, that fill you with deeper thinking, and that with smartphones. What other ways are the humanities under threat right now?
Well, I mean, part of the challenge for the humanities now is just that there are a lot of people who don't think there's a relationship between the degrees, the subjects, and the jobs that students will get. I think a
Yeah.
lot of that is that they tend to think, they take a class in German intellectual history and they think they've only got content knowledge. They've only learned about whoever the texts are that they're reading or the people that they're studying. And they don't realize that they're actually developing a lot of really good, strong, and valuable skills that somebody like me as an employer really wants out of a student coming out of college. They're figuring out how to gather information, organize it, put it together in language, and then communicate it to somebody else. Like those are skills that I think a lot of employers really want and really value. We've got lots of studies that show that. But too often students just think, I'm only getting content knowledge. And so when we look at surveys of alumni, you see that humanities students are the least graduates are the least likely to say they see a relationship between their jobs and their degrees. And so, I give these talks now at like alumni nights aimed at undergraduates where I talk about like, these are the skills you're developing, like start to develop a vocabulary so that you know what skills you have, what skills you like to use, what skills an employer might hire you for. And so you can start thinking about who those employers are. And so I've given that talk a number of times. And in the last couple, I've had alumni who have described these amazing jobs, basically doing like communications for law firms and things like that. And they come up to me afterwards and they're like, I've never felt more validated about getting my history degree than until I heard your talk. And I was like, why? And so it's like stuff like that.
Right.
So
drawing that connection between the discipline and what you're doing for your job isn't always explicit in the classroom.
It's very rare. And I've been trying to convince more faculty that they just need to be more transparent with their students and say, in this class, you're going to learn about our subject, but you're also going to be developing these really useful, valuable skills that employers want. Just so that there's some clarity around that. I think that could be quite
just one example of that is that I think that everybody who wants to work with computers in the future should be taking theology. And the rationale for that is that theology is a discipline about abstractions, about things that you cannot see, and you have to draw correlations between these things and understand how these abstract principles interrelate. This is a precise description of computer science. Because computer science is also layers of abstractions on top of each other. And unless you've been able to deal with abstractions without marrying them to some sort of user interface, you don't really have a conceptual framework in your mind of an abstraction that doesn't have a button on it or doesn't have a piece of code associated with it. Because really, all computer languages are abstractions. They are not like typing zeros and ones into clean pieces of metal and silicon. We aren't doing that. We're adding layers. Like all these frameworks are just theological abstractions. And so being able to explain to people that philosophy and theology are the core ways that you learn how to think with abstract ideas and create models of worlds that do not exist, drawing that connection would be super helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And, and it's funny because in Asia, there are a bunch of like in India and Japan, there's kind of a push to add the liberal arts back into the curriculum because I think there's a growing recognition that you if you only train somebody to do engineering or computers, or whatever sort of very narrow, specific task oriented project, that you lose that capacity. That without that sort of grounding in that sort of pushes your boundaries to think beyond the
Yeah.
sort of the specific task orientation, like that's where you really need to develop different sorts of muscles so that you're ready to think sort of outside the box in a lot of really interesting, which is what actually is where creation, I think, often tends to come from, rather than just simply sort of tinkering around the edges at problem solving. And so that I think is where I think the humanities and some of the other sort of associated social sciences and the arts can really help to set people up for greater success, because they've got a broader understanding and they can draw in more perspectives, more angles on a subject than somebody who's simply been trained to sort of push a button, push widgets, or solve a problem in a very specific kind of task oriented way.
Right. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'll ask a big question, which you've to some extent already answered. But today, democracy is under threat around the world. The possibility of liberalization in thinking and of intellectual liberalization is also under threat by various regimes. So today, how can the humanities help? Why should we go back to the humanities as a way to help us in this period?
Because I think the humanities are our toolkit from the past. They provide us with the explanations in some ways, the perspectives that we often need in terms of helping us understand how we got to where we are today. Why I think too often we just tend to focus on the immediate and not focus on, like, how did we get here? So as a historian, I like to think, the how we got here part is really important in terms of unpacking the, sort of the things that seem so hard and inflexible and impossible to solve. Because when you look at them historically, you realize that they've always been in a process of change. And so this sort of change process outside of the immediate moment can actually be really kind of vitalizing. It creates a sense of opportunity and prospect. It also provides some perspective on kind of how one might think through some of these problems, because there aren't many situations that haven't had some decent analog in the past. And so, from that perspective, there's also sort of useful resources to be gained there as well. But also, I think a lot of the skills that we teach as part of the humanities can be incredibly important as well. And I think, one of the things when I talk about how we engage with AI, for instance, is that, we, in most of our subjects in the humanities, we teach a certain level of information literacy and a certain amount of suspicion about information that's delivered to us. And to me, that seems like a set of skills that make us even sort of create even better value in an AI sort of environment, because this, if you're actually taking your humanities classes seriously, you're not just taking the information that comes out of AI that it serves up to you and sort of taking that and saying, oh, that's good. You're looking at it as something that's often poorly written, or at least written in this sort of average American voice in most cases, in a way that actually doesn't tend to, I think, convey emotion, drive, importance, significance in ways that can be really useful as a vehicle of communication to other people. But it also tends to provide, sort of, what do they call them? Hallucinations, things like that, false information. Right. And this is where, those of us that are trained to be suspicious of information that we read can often go and just sort of look at that and say, is that really true? Because that, that doesn't seem quite right. And ask that second question that says, where do I, how do I double check this? Where can I go to look for information that will actually confirm or deny or refute this piece of information? Because I know even in my regular job, I sometimes go to ChatGPT and say, have these two organizations worked together in the past? And it'll often initially say yes. And then I say, all right, well, give me an example. And then it's
give me chapter and verse, right?
Yeah, give me some examples. And then it's like, oh, well, actually, no. I can't actually find any evidence for that. It's just or they happen to have some similarity in their names or something like that. And so, so that's where I feel like the humanities is not just a set of sort of information that we can draw from to help us think through these things. It also gives us a toolkit of skills that we can take out into the world and actually, I think, begin to help solve some of the challenges that we currently are facing.
Yeah, well, you give talks regularly about the humanities and about the importance thereof. And you are kind of a cheerleader for the humanities. So could you give us one of your cheerleading sessions? Like, why should we go to the humanities, and how are people being resilient in fighting back against this kind of flood of anti-humanities sentiment?
I mean, the talks that I usually give are usually focused just on looking at the data about
Uh-huh.
about career outcomes for humanities majors. When you look at the career outcomes of our graduates, their earnings are similar to almost every other college graduate out
Hmm.
there. The one exception is engineers, and frankly, for most of us, engineering was not the alternative career choice for
Yeah.
those of us that like to work with words and those sorts of things. So when I get in arguments with people on LinkedIn, for instance, about, oh, well, but like why shouldn't people, get engineering degrees then? It's like, well, A, that's not all of us have capacity to be engineers. B, if you're going to say that the earnings of engineers is the only metric for success, that means you need to shut down business programs, social science programs. You need to shut down everything else, teaching programs. So, from that perspective, I just feel like there's a real imbalance, and I don't know why. It's always a frustration to me that when I talk to journalists, for instance, they want to compare engineering salaries to humanities salaries when, the humanities are kind of dead in the middle in terms of earnings and the return on investment compared to somebody who doesn't get a college degree at all. I mean, we humanities majors earn about 36% more than people who don't get a college degree. So from
Right.
that perspective, the career out, sort of the economic metrics, I think, are in our favor. But then also when you look at job satisfaction, career satisfaction, most of our folks are pretty satisfied by those metrics as well. Oh,
Yeah. So the humanities provides for more flexibility in the future.
yes, exactly. And yeah, so it creates a wide variety of these opportunities that are actually incredibly valuable, I think, for folks in
Mhm.
terms of being sort of set up for success in a wide, in and when you look in terms of occupations, our humanities majors are everywhere. I mean, we're one of the most widely distributed career outcomes of of any degree field,
Mhm.
and which presents a certain challenge. So when you look at how humanities majors sort of go into the workforce, they usually go through two or three different jobs. And some of that, I think, is the fact that we don't do a very good job of telling students about the skills that they've developed. So they have to spend a little time sort of figuring out for themselves, like which skills they have, which skills they like to use, where somebody might employ them. So in the first few years, humanities
Mhm.
majors, I frankly, I think tend to struggle a little bit, which is part of
Yeah.
the my pitch to faculty is like we can do better by our students. But then beyond that, I mean, they're just a world of opportunity awaits most of our students because we live in a world where words actually are really everything in so many
Yeah.
ways, and so we are, you're trained up in capacities that are actually incredibly valuable in the world that we live in today.
Right, right. And I've worked in the technology sphere for a number of years. And when I meet with an engineer who has only ever studied engineering, software engineering, after a layoff, often they feel very bereft of their identity because they've only done this one thing. And what's interesting is that when I meet with humanities people, they're like, great, I can write my book. Or I can go back to that Russian novel that I tried to translate years ago. Or I'm working in this area for this nonprofit. There's a breadth of intellectual aptitude and resilience that I think the humanities gives you that I'm not sure that you get always in other disciplines. Not to speak poorly of other disciplines, but I think if you're just narrowly focused, you don't have that capacity to stretch out and be able to see possibilities.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, really, I mean, in a lot of ways, we're set up to be lifelong learners because
Mhm.
we're I mean, we in most cases we're attracted to these subjects because we're interested in engaging with words, and we're
Yeah.
surrounded. I mean, this is, as you can see, I love to be surrounded by words.
Yeah.
Like there's always another book, another subject, another topic to engage with, and like that sort of curiosity that we engage and encourage in our students can actually be really important. And so
Yeah.
we saw that in the survey we did of the public, that the humanities majors were the most likely to be continuing to engage with things like, to be the readers, to be sort of looking up the background of information, the history of things on the web,
Yeah.
watching documentary films. I mean, most Americans, regardless of their college degree or not, are doing some degree of that, but humanities majors are always engaging in these.
Always engaged in the world and the world of ideas as well.
Yeah.
Well, just to put you on the spot for a minute, we've seen a lot of people saying that humanities disciplines can be replaced by large language models. They've ingested the dictionary, they've ingested the encyclopedia, so we don't need to have somebody who's actually read the encyclopedia. We can just go to a large language model. How would you say that idea is wrong?
I mean, based on the information that I get out of AI, I don't feel that it's not an adequate substitute for somebody
Yeah.
who, I mean, first you need to know how to ask the question, to frame the question, and to think about why it's important. And then if you're going to try and communicate it to somebody, you need to have a certain amount of interest and engagement in the subject in a way that I feel like folks who simply rely on AI in much the same way that they used to rely on Wikipedia to provide them with an information nugget don't really know how to, it's not particularly valuable beyond sort of answering some very specific, typically very narrow question that's usually in response to somebody else's argument. Whereas, from a humanistic perspective, if you're looking more broadly at why is this question important, why, what is the best answer and to respond to this, and how do we then build up a set of skills and muscles so that we're able to do a better job of engaging with these questions and communicating with others. I think that's where some of our skills have, I think, begun to. You see it atrophying around in a lot of these other things. I mean, I engage a fair amount in social media, and I'm often really struck at how superficial and, in some ways, just simply reactive a lot of the conversation is, in ways that I find really kind of mind-numbingly stupid, to be honest.
Right. It's very, very disheartening to feel like our body politic has devolved to this level of discourse.
Yeah, because it's not really a discourse so much as just a set of, it's sort of like two people standing on a cliff and just sort of shooting a cannon at each other. I mean, that's not really engaging in a discourse. It's not engaging in the back and forth and the debate that actually helps us advance sort of human knowledge in the world we live in. I think that's just a critical problem for it.
Right. I heard Timothy Snyder speak recently here in the city of Portland, Oregon, where I live, and he mentioned Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent debate on a podcast where they discussed some of their ideas and how they differed from one another. And I felt like that level of engagement was actually instructive to show people what it looked like to disagree with somebody and yet continue the conversation and not denigrate the other person or their ideas, but instead take their ideas seriously and try to grapple with them.
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things about working at the American Academy is that we're almost instinctively bipartisan. So we're always trying to bring together people so that we can talk across a lot of those boundaries that often seem so hard and fast. But then, when you look at social media and you look at sort of the talking heads on TV, but when you actually bring people together in a room to talk about a subject, a subject that they each care about, in a way that's sort of freed from the rhetorical flourishes that I feel like drive a lot of the conversation today, you discover how much commonality there actually is on a lot of really critical questions, and how much easier it is to find a solution once you actually try and engage sort of where each party is coming from. and try and actually think about solutions that actually will push us forward. In theory, we have a legislature that is supposed to be doing that sort of thing, and sadly, I think Yuval Levin, who's a new member of the Academy, is a conservative from the American Enterprise Institute, has talked about how one of the problems we have is that we tend to treat institutions as sort of something that gives us credibility rather than thinking about how our role fits backwards and helps to sort of use that institution and develop that institution as a place for conversation to happen. And I think I find his perspective on that something I keep coming back to, because I find that is, the question of how we actually engage with each other on these questions, rather than think about how to sort of use our institutions as platforms by which to sort of share our sort of loftier thoughts with the world.
Right.
Really important.
Yeah, it does bring to mind the fact that we here at the Human Intelligence Institute, we are actually helping people to identify themselves as humans, oddly enough, online, because we're seeing a lot of bot content and a lot of content that is AI derived. I say derived because it's all derived from people ultimately, but it's massaged synthetic data. And we're trying to identify actual human voices so that when you're engaging with someone, they're actually human. When what they're saying something they actually stand behind and their real persona. They aren't just a cell phone on a rack somewhere in North Korea, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I was just curious what you thought of that idea and the general utility of that approach.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, to me, that's so much of what we need to be doing. And, I was just visiting with family, many of whom don't share my political opinions. And, I'm often, and I'm struck as I am every time I get in these sort of environments at just how, if we avoid politics, how much we have to talk about. I keep coming away from it because, when I'm by myself and listening to podcasts, I'm constantly having arguments with them in my head about, and sort of responding to whatever's making me mad at the moment, and assuming that it's like, how can they believe these sorts of things? But then we actually get in a room together and, we start talking about our kids and our jobs, and you just realize that there's in many ways so much more to life and to being human than the political crises of the day. And so how we find those vantage points and those stances, I mean, in some ways, that's why when I get particularly depressed, I just retreat back to history and find that it's actually often provides a really good perspective on thinking through, thinking through the direction of things, that there's a before, there's going to be an after, there's not just a present. And so how we begin to think of sort of flows of human time can actually be incredibly important in these things, and the human dimension of the people that we're engaging with. And so I agree that sounds like a wonderful, wonderful way of sort of unpacking some of the problems that we have here.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate the conversation with you today, Robert, and thank you for espousing the value of the humanities and what we're doing as well.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's great to engage with you.
You can find out more about any of these news items and hear the complete interview on the extended premium version of our podcast at humanintelligence.news. Today's episode was produced by Ned Hayes and engineered by Muhammad Adnan. Our analog-only human-themed music was created for the Human Intelligence podcast by Josh Pinkston of Nature and Spirit. This episode, and every episode, is brought to you by the Human Intelligence Institute team. Thanks for listening to today's episode. As always, this episode is available online at humanintelligence.news.